All right, guys, this is chapter 14, part 2. We are on page 120. We're learning a little bit more about the life in the village. We've learned that things have been so bad that Ochek, who is now seems to be an adult, is still the youngest and strongest in the village. Things were so bad in the village of Mizawa that no more babies were being born, and people started dying, or the beings started dying. We talked a little bit about this, about pemmican, about the history of pemmican and how important it was to Indigenous people and the Métis people in Canada, and how, because pemmican was very valuable, it's so full of essential fats and nutrition that people could eat it and it sustained them long time. They could survive on it. The Canadian government at the time didn't like that the Indigenous and Métis people had this food source that they were able to sustain themselves with, so pemmican became illegal. And we see pemmican happening in this story, so that's nice. We talked a little bit too about how when a community stops having children in it, and this is what's happening in Mizawa right now, that is a huge red flag that that community is dying, that it won't survive, that that community and its culture and its traditions will not survive. And so we talked a little bit about how there's a bit of a connection there to Canada, and how the Canadian government took children out of Indigenous communities and put them into residential homes and residential schools, and terrible things happened there. And that was a direct act of trying to change Indigenous people into more European people. It was a direct act trying to get rid of Indigenous traditions and ways of life. So when there are no children in a community, that community starts to die, just like what is happening in Mizawa. They talk about Mizawa being barren. Okay? It's empty. It's lost. Okay? So lots of symbolism happening in this story. Okay, we are here. They needed rest before checking Ochek's traps. It had been a long, hard day walking from Mizawa. After Ochek finished his story, they settled in for the night. Morgan lay close to the fire, facing it. She closed her eyes, but, despite her exhaustion, didn't fall asleep quickly. She listened to the wind outside, its distant howl song serenading her as it danced through the trees. She listened to the fire crackle softly, like it was trying to be quiet, trying to allow them rest. Amid these sounds, her mind wandered. She tried to think if this was the first time she'd ever been camping. She was sure it was. A family she stayed with a few years earlier, family number 5, she guessed, had gone on camping trips, but hadn't taken her with them. They'd seen fit, just like the family before Katie and James, to send her off to respite instead. What was so awful about her that they'd rather leave her behind than take her with them? And then she thought, am I awful? Yesterday she had been. She knew that much. She pictured her mother in the tiny room. She imagined herself outside the room, looking at her through the window. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't imagine herself in the room. She couldn't imagine herself in her mother's arms, being sung to, being told in Cree not to forget herself. But what was there to forget? That question, asked like a voiceover to the short film playing in her mind, of her mother in the room and her outside in the cold, was the last thing Morgan remembered before finally falling asleep. So yes, she remembers now her mother telling her, don't forget, don't forget. But she has forgot. She doesn't even know what she has forgot. Her memories, her inside, her understanding of who she is empty. Morgan also is barren inside. She doesn't know who she is. She doesn't even know what she's forgot. In the morning, they ate a quick meal, broth and dried meat again, no more pemmican, and took down the hut. The wind had returned overnight, and without 3 bodies weighing it down, the dwelling would certainly have flown off into the forest. Depending on how the day went, they'd either set it up again that night in the same spot, or make camp somewhere on the trek back to Misawa. The relentless wind and cold made the hours spent checking traps all the more frustrating. It felt like braving the elements should yield some kind of reward, even the smallest of animals to bring the villagers. But time and again, they were met with the same reality, an empty trap. Okay, so Misawa is barren. It's barren of children. It's barren of people. It's barren. And so is the area around it. It's empty. There's nothing. There have been many trips like this one, Ochek said at one point, seeing how disheartened the kids were. And there have been trips that have been better. Some help we are, Morgan said to Eli. And then a thought occurred to her. Did you catch anything when you were with him alone? Just you two? A couple times, he said. You being here didn't keep the traps empty, Ochek assured Morgan. So Morgan thinks it's her. She thinks she's bad luck. Here I am, I'm supposed to be helping, and we're not getting anything in the traps. Ochek had an empty sack over his shoulders. And it was the saddest thing Morgan had ever seen. A knife was tucked into his belt to prepare the game on the spot. It would then be brought to Misawa to become clothing, utensils, and most important, food. Morgan kept thinking about the racks she'd seen outside the lodges and how most of them were barren. So we can see how every part of the animal is used for something. Clothing, utensils, food, every part, okay? There's no just killing an animal to kill it or killing an animal just to eat it. It's you are taking the life from an animal, from another life form, and because of that, you are going to use every part of that being in every possible way. On they went, making their own tracks, but finding no others, and checking more traps with no animals in them. They had the smallest and least satisfying lunch behind a large tree that offered little protection from the wind and snow. Broth made out of melted snow, pine needles, and bark. After lunch, it was more of the same. Morgan began to wonder if she should have come at all, if she shouldn't have just gone off with Eli from Misawa right when she'd found him. All I've done is start to care about them, and they're dying, Morgan said to Eli, quietly enough that Ochek couldn't hear. What good is that? I still wouldn't leave if I had a choice, he said. What? She hit him on the chest. If you stayed, you'd just die too. How does that make any sense? Morgan wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. Eli looked at her with a stone face. I'd be more alive here, even if I was dying. Are you listening to yourself? You... Shh! Ochek hissed at the two foster siblings. They stopped fighting. Ochek was crouched down, staring off into the forest through the blustering snow. Without looking at them, without looking away from whatever he saw, he raised a finger and beckoned them over with it. They eased forward with great care until they were at his side. He pointed in the direction he'd been staring. "I don't see anything," Morgan whispered. "Look," Eli pointed too. She peered through the storm until she finally saw it. There was another animal being standing at one of the traps. It was oblivious to the group's presence. That means it doesn't realize that they're there. Okay, oblivious. "Maybe you're luckier than you think." Ochek pulled out his knife. He started to move towards the animal. Morgan and Eli followed a safe distance behind, worried they would make a noise. It was a squirrel, maybe a foot shorter than Ochek, and dressed in the same sort of clothing that he wore. Its bushy tail protruded from dark pants, and it wore a long-sleeved green hooded top. The children didn't say anything to each other, just exchanged the same upset looks. How was it okay that Ochek planned to kill another animal being that walked on 2 legs? He talked about 4-legged ones. Presumably, that's what the villagers in Mizwa ate. Animals that didn't walk or talk and were the same size as the animals Eli and Morgan were familiar with in their world. This felt like a person killing a person. When Ochek was nearly at the unsuspecting squirrel, with his knife raised and ready for the kill, Eli called out, "Run!" The squirrel leaped to the side in time for the knife to stab into the trap, which was empty. The animal that had been in the trap, a hare, was now in the squirrel's mouth and very dead, dangling half in and half out. Ochek glared at Eli, and it sent a shiver down Morgan's spine. Eli backed away, and so did she. "Isn't it one of your own?" Eli asked. The squirrel spat out the hair and it landed on the ground, only somewhat chewed up. "Yes, aren't I?" Ochek picked up the hair and stuffed it triumphantly into the once empty sack. "Let her go now," Morgan pleaded. Ochek looked very much as though he wanted to get angry with the children, but instead he took a deep breath. "Children, normally I agree, but we need this food."